Bending down to pick the mushrooms, people called each other in cheerful voices each time they found a rich cluster. They were answered by soft cacophony of birds calling from the thickets of hazels and junipers, from the branches of the oaks and hornbeams. Sometimes the sinister cry of an owl was heard, but no one could see it in its deep, rich, hidden hole in some tree trunk. A reddish fox might scurry away from the dense bushes after a feast of partridge eggs. Vipers would crawl nervously, hissing to give themselves courage. A fat hare would be bound to the bush with huge leaps. The symphony of the forest was broken only by the puffing of the locomotive, the rattle of cars, the grinding of the brakes. People stood still, looking towards the tracks. The birds grew silent, the owls drew deeper into their hole, draping his gray cloak about himself with dignity. A hare stood up, raising his long high ears, and reassured resumed his leaps. In the week that followed until the mushroom season ended, we often walked along the railroad tracks. Occasionally we passed some oblong heaps of black ashes and some charred bones, broken and trodden to gravel. With pursed lips, men stopped and stared. Some people feared that even the burnt corpses of those jumping off the train might contaminate both men and animals, and would hastily kick dirt over the ashes. Once I pretended to pick up a mushroom which had dropped out of my basket, and grabbed a handful of the human dust. I stuck to my fingers and smelled of gasoline. I looked at it closely, but could find no trace of a person. Yet this ash was not like the ash left in kitchen ovens where wood, dried peat, or moss was burned. I became frightened. It seemed to me, as I rubbed the handful of ash in my fingers, that the ghost of the burnt person hovered over me, watching and remembering all of us. I knew that the ghost might never leave me, that it might follow me, haunt me at night, sleep sickness into my veins and madness into my brain. After each train had passed, I saw a whole battalion of ghosts with evil, vengeful faces coming into the world. The peasants said that smoke from the crematories went straight to heaven, laying a soft carpet at God's feet, without ever soiling them. I wondered whether so many Jews were necessary to compensate God for the killing of his Son. Perhaps the world would soon become one vast incinerator for burning people. Had not the priest said that all were doomed to perish, to go from ashes to ashes? Along the embankment, between the rails, we found innumerable scraps of paper, notebook, calendars, family photographs, printed personal documents, old passports, and diaries. The pictures were, of course, the most desirable to collect, since no one in the village could read. In some of the pictures, elderly people in peculiar clothes sat stiffly. In others, elegant-dressed parents stood with their arms on the shoulders of their children, all smiling and wearing clothing of a type that no one in the village had ever seen. Sometimes we found photographs of beautiful young girls, prettier than angels in church, or bearded men with piercing black eyes. There were pictures of old men who looked like apostles, and old ladies with faded smiles. In some, one could see children playing in the park, babies crying, or newlyweds kissing. On the reverse of these were some scribbled farewells, oaths, or religious passages, in hands obviously shaken by fear, or the motion of the train. The words were often washed off by the morning dew, or bleached out by the sun. The peasants eagerly collected these articles. The women giggled and whispered to one another about the pictures of the men, while the men muttered obscene jokes and comments about the pictures of the girls. People in the village collected these photographs, traded them, and hung them in their huts and barns. In some houses there was pictures of Our Lady on one wall, of Christ on another, a crucifix on a third, and a picture of numerous Jews on the fourth. Farmers would come up to hired hands exchanging pictures of girls, staring excitedly at them and playing indecently with each other. And it was said that one of the more attractive village girls fell so hopelessly in love with a handsome man in the photograph that she would not look at her fiancé afterwards. One day, a boy brought back news from the mushroom field of the Jewish girl found by the railroad tracks. She was alive, with only a sprained shoulder and some bruises. They surmised that she had dropped through a hole in the floor where the train slowed down on a curve and thus escaped more serious injuries. Everyone turned to see at this marvel. The girl staggered along, half carried by some man. Her thin face was very pale. She had thick eyebrows and very black eyes. Her long, glossy black hair was tied with a ribbon and fell down at her back. Her dress was torn, and you could see bruises and scratches on her white body. With her good arm, she tried to hold up the injured one. The men took her to the house of the village head. A curious crowd assembled, looking over her carefully. She did not seem to understand anything. Whenever any of the men came near her, she joined her hands as though in prayer and babbled in a language no one could understand. Terrified, she stared about her with her eyes that had blue-white eyeballs and jet-black pupils. The village headman conferred with some of the elders of the village, and also with Rainbow, the man who had found the Jewess. It was decided that according with official regulations she would be sent to the Germans' post the next day. The peasants slowly dispersed to their homes, but some of the bolder ones stayed on, watching the girl and cracking jokes. Half-blind old women spat thrice in her direction and muttered under their breath, warned their grandsons. Then Rainbow took the girl by his arm and led her to his hut. Though some thought him odd, he was well liked in the village. He took special interest in heavenly signs, especially rainbows, hence his nickname. In the evenings, when he entertained his neighbors, he could talk for hours about rainbows. Listening to him from a dark corner, I learned that rainbow is a long arched stalk, hollow as a straw. One end is an immense river or lake and draws the water off, for it to distribute fairly over the countryside. Fishes and other creatures often drawn up with the water, and that is why one finds the same kind of fish in widely separated lakes, ponds, and rivers. Rainbow's hut adjoined my master's. His barn shared a wall with the barn in which I slept. His wife had died some time ago, but Rainbow, still young, could not decide on another mate. His neighbors used to say that those stared at rainbows too much could not see an ass in front of their faces. An old woman cooked for Rainbow and looked after his children while he worked in the fields and got drunk once in a while for recreation. The Jewess was to spend the night in Rainbow's home. That evening I was awakened by noises and cries from the barn. At first I was scared, but I found a knothole through which I could see what was happening. In the middle of the clean threshing floor, the girl was lying on some sacks. Next to her, an oil lamp was burning on an old chopping block. Rainbow sat close to her head. Neither moved. The Rainbow, with quick movement, pulled the dress off the girl's shoulders. The strap gave way. The girl tried to escape, but Rainbow kneeled on her long hair and held her face between his knees. He leaned closer. Then he tore the other strap off. The girl cried, but remained motionless. Rainbow crawled to her feet, wedging them between his legs, and with a deft jerk pulled off her dress. She tried to rise and hold on to the material with a good hand, but Rainbow pushed her back. She was now naked. The flickering light of the oil lamp threw shadows on her pulsing breasts. Rainbow sat at the girl's side and stroked her body with his big hands. His bulk hid her face from me, but I could hear the quiet sobbing, broken occasionally by a cry. Slowly Rainbow took off his knee boots and breeches, leaving only one rough shirt. He straddled the prostrate girl and moved his hand gently over her shoulders, breast, and belly. She moaned and whined, uttered strange words in her language. When his touch grew rougher, Rainbow breathed heavily. He lifted himself on his elbows, slipped down a little, and with one brutal push opened her legs and fell on her with a thud. The girl arched her body, screamed, and kept opening and closing her fingers, as though trying to grasp something. Then something strange happened. Rainbow was on top of the girl, his legs between her, but trying to break away. Every time he lifted himself, she screamed with pain. He had groaned and cursed. He tried again to detach himself from her crotch, but seemed unable to do so. He was held fast by some strange force inside of her, just as a hare or a fox is caught in a snare. He remained on top of the girl, trembling violently. After a while he renewed his efforts, but each time the girl writhed in pain. He also seemed to suffer. He wiped the perspiration off his face, swore, and spat. The next try the girl wanted to help. She opened her legs wider, lifted her hips, and pushed with her good hand against his belly. It was all in vain. An invisible bond held them together. I had often seen the same thing happen to dogs. Sometimes when they coupled violently, starved for a release, they could not break loose again. They struggled with a painful tie, turning more and more away from each other, finally joined only at their rear ends. They seemed to be one body with two heads, and two tails growing in the same place. From man's friend, they became nature's practical joke. They howled, yelped, and shook all over. Their bloodshot eyes, begging for help, gaped with unspeakable agony at the people hitting them with their rakes and sticks. Rolling on the dust and bleeding under the blows, they redoubled their efforts to break apart. People laughed, kicked the dogs, threw screeching cats and rocks at them. The animals tried to run away, but each headed in the opposite direction. They ran in circles. In mad rage, they tried to bite each other. Finally, they gave up and waited for the human help. Some village boys would throw them into a river or pond. They tried desperately to swim, but each kept pulling away from the other. They were helpless, and their heads only emerged from time to time, frothing at their mouth, too weak to bark. As the current carried them away, an amused crowd followed along the riverbank, shouting with joy, throwing stones at their heads as they bobbed out of the water. Rainbow renewed his efforts. He appealed loudly to the Virgin Mary for help. He panted and puffed. He made another big heave, trying to tear himself away from the girl. She screamed and started at the bewildered man's face with his fists, scratched him with her nails, bit his hands. Rainbow licked at the blood of his lip, lifted himself on one arm, and dealt the girl a powerful blow with the other. Panic must have dimmed his brain, for he collapsed on the top of her, biting her breast, arms, and neck. He hammered her body with his fist, then grabbed her flesh as if trying to tear it off. The girl screamed with a high-pitched, steady cry, finally broke off with her throat dried up, and then started again. Rainbow went on beating her till he was exhausted. They lay on top of each other, motionless and silent. The flickering oil lamp was the only thing that moved. Rainbow started crying for help. His shouts brought first a band of barking dogs, then some alarmed men and axes and knives. They opened the door of the barn and uncomprehendingly goggled at the couple on the floor. The old woman came, kneed by locked couple, and did something to them with the help of others. I could see nothing, only heard the girl's last piercing shriek. Then there was silence, and Rainbow's barn grew dark. At dawn, I ran to the knothole. Sunshine was coming in through the slots through the boards, lighting up the sparkling beams of grain dust. On the flushing floor, close to the wall, a human shape lay stretched out flat, covered from head to foot with a horse blanket. I had to take the cows to pasture, while the village was still asleep. When I returned at dusk, I heard the peasants discussing the previous night's events. Rainbow had taken the body back to the railroad track, where the patrol was due to pass in the morning. For several weeks, the village had a lively topic of conversation. Rainbow himself, when he had taken a few drinks, would tell people how the Jewess had sucked him in and wouldn't let him go. Strange dreams haunted me at night. I heard moans and cries in the barn. An icy hand touched me. Black strands of hair smelling of gasoline stroked my face. At dawn, I took the cattle to pasture. I looked fearfully at the mist floating over the fields. Sometimes the wind would push along tiny shreds of soot, clearly heading in my direction. I shivered, and cold sweat poured down my back. The bit of soot circled over my head, looked me straight in the eye, and then drifted high into heaven to the feet of God himself.